Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my illustration planning process. I recently returned from an 8-day trip to Italy. It was amazing, and along with some very special memories that I will now treasure forever, I came home with so much art inspiration. So I thought it'd be really fun if we explored one of these illustration ideas inspired by my trip to Italy. I figured it's probably best to start out by gathering some reference photos first, by creating a reference board with the help of Milanote, who is the sponsor of today's video. Milanote offers a flexible space that is perfect for developing ideas in the early stages of a creative project. I'm going to share with you how I used Milanote to help me visualize this illustration project and put a plan together to bring it to life. So I started out by making a super simple reference board for the background of my illustration by dragging and dropping some of the photos that I took at the Roman Forum and Palatine Hill. I'll explain the inspiration as I go along throughout the video. It was really easy to put together this board just by dragging the photos in. Then I created another reference board, sort of a pose inspiration board with these photos of poses that have the general vibe that I'm after for the piece. And while I always try to come up with my own poses for my characters, it was helpful to refer to during this brainstorming phase to capture that certain vibe that I'm after. You can resize and crop into the image as you see fit and move the elements around very easily. So I really like that because I could view so many more images on the screen all at once. It really is nice to actually have all of your reference photos in one contained spot like this, as opposed to having just like a million different preview windows open, which is often how I operate and why I get really frustrated with using reference photos in the first place. And with these reference boards up on the screen to use as a jumping off point, I got to sketching in my sketchbook my very first ideas. So let me finally elaborate on what the inspiration is and how I arrived at it. Again, it was my third day exploring in Rome, which happened to be such a gorgeous sunny day, and on this day I visited the Colosseum as well as the Roman Forum and Palatine Hill. And the Roman Forum Palatine Hill area is basically an open air museum full of ruins left behind of ancient Rome. And as iconic as the Colosseum is, the Roman Forum and Palatine Hill area was actually my favorite to explore, and I would say it made more of an impression on me, maybe because it marries both the iconic ancient Roman architecture with nature. I don't know, something about seeing all these ruins scattered across an open field was really beautiful, and it felt really peaceful to be there. I was especially struck by this area pictured in this photo on the Palatine Hill. I don't remember exactly what this specific area is. I admit that I didn't read all the little plaques explaining everything as I was going around. I was mostly there for the vibes. It was just this open field of grass with all these little small flowers scattered throughout, with those iconic Italian trees. I kind of think of them as broccoli trees, but these very iconic Italian trees lining the horizon. It just felt so tranquil to walk through this area. And that's really it. I just felt in that moment being in the sun and in this beautiful, very novel new environment for me. I felt really compelled to try to capture that feeling of being there and feeling really at peace. So I envisioned a character laying out on the field, just basking in the sun against this beautiful backdrop. And honestly, it's super simple of an idea, but that's usually how my painting ideas start out. Just trying to capture the feeling of being at peace and basking in the sun. So as you can see, I'm trying to search for a pose that conveys that kind of feeling that I'm after, and I draw until I feel honestly inspired by my own drawing. But usually when I start out on a new painting idea, I do often start out by drawing some bad drawings because I don't have any reference point to work from. These are the first initial drawings, so I allow myself to draw these bad drawings. But with every drawing, I feel I get a little bit closer to that elusive pose that I am chasing after in my head. This drawing here, on top of it being not a very good drawing, it kind of reminded me of Alice from Alice in Wonderland just because of the big bow and the way I drew her hair and how I put a headband on the hair. And so I made a note to myself to not draw the hair in this way. But I do really like the direction of having the character in like a really billowy and puffy kind of dress. I really wanted to play with the big kind of shapes that these dresses provide as just like a fun visual element. Felt like I needed some kind of element of drama in the clothing to just make it more visually interesting. Posing for me is perhaps the most important part of an illustration. My illustrations are usually very character-centric, and oftentimes I am trying to convey some sort of mood through the character's pose and their facial expression, and that is really a lot of times the focal point in my illustration. So I spend a lot of time in this stage trying to nail that pose, trying to find a pose that really conveys the feeling that I described earlier in the way that appeals to me as an artist, visually speaking as well, obviously. I like this pose of her lying on her back with her face being kind of pressed up by the volume of the puffy sleeves and collar. I think that's an element I wanted in my drawing, something pressing up against the face like that. It sounds random, but I find that that's kind of an element that I like including in a lot of my works. And I think it's important to stay attuned to little quirky things like that, because I think that is kind of what defines your style. Again, the drawing is a little crude, but I really like this pose with this kind of exposed underside of the skirt, revealing the like petticoat, I guess. It reminded me of one of my older illustrations where I really abstracted the like petticoat layers of the skirt, and I really liked it, and I've always wanted to kind of go back to that. So speaking of which, here's another board that I made with other art inspiration that I wanted to kind of emulate in my piece. There is nothing wrong or like cringy about referencing your own artwork, right? This is the first pose where I felt it was the closest to what I think I was envisioning, with the character sitting upright, head lowered, but I wasn't exactly sure how to position the arm or the legs. But I do think this was the closest one so far with the right kind of feel that I was looking for. So I felt like I was finally onto something here. But I try to explore a bunch of different ideas before I narrow in on one idea, just to make sure I am exploring all avenues and I'm not going to regret going in one direction. So I drew a pose where the character is on her stomach and resting her head on her arms, and I can also see this being really lovely as well, but ultimately I do decide that this isn't quite the right direction that I want to go with. So as I was drawing each of these sketches, I created another board, and I would take a photo of each of these sketches and drop them into the board, and would make notes about what I liked about each one and what I didn't like about each one. And I actually found it really helpful to see my drawings like this side by side, since it was easier to refer to when they were all together like this than having to flip through the previous pages of my sketchbook. And being able to make notes on it directly on the board was really helpful, so I didn't have to mark up my sketches in my sketchbook because sometimes I don't like doing that. It really did make things a lot easier for me there. By the end of this drawing session, I felt I had two directions I could go with in terms of the character's pose, the one where she is sitting upright and the one where she's lying on her back. So at this point, I was confident bringing these poses into the next stage of my illustration process, which is the thumbnailing stage. So now we've arrived at the thumbnailing stage. Thumbnail drawings are basically small-scale versions of the full piece. So this is where I figure out how to set up the rest of the picture to support the character. And it helps to do them smaller in scale at first to have a more zoomed out view of the overall composition to avoid getting lost in unnecessary details. I start thumbnailing by drawing small rectangles in the ratio I think I'm going to use, and usually start by just like plopping down the character and building out the background from that. This first one was super rough. I was just placing down all the elements I thought I was going to include in the composition, but I wasn't sure at this point where everything was going to go. But I did envision the piece being horizontal, so I started out with that. And for a sense of scale, I threw in the little like column remnants in the midground and foreground around the characters to give the space a sense of depth. And I made the horizon line high since I feel like the angle we're looking at for the character is downward, like onto the character, with the like iconic Italian trees lining the horizon. The second thumbnail drawing, I tested out a slightly different thing where I place a character leaning onto a tree. There was this like great tree, a fallen tree in the Palatine Hill area that I took a photo of that just looked so lovely. I don't know, I think trees are lovely, and this was like a really nice looking dead tree. And I just really liked how that looked, so I thought maybe I will include it in the piece, but I ultimately just decided against it because I don't think I wanted the character to be leaning on anything. I think I just wanted the character to be like free, kind of standing. Well, they're not standing, they're sitting, but yeah, I wanted them to just be propped up on their own. But yeah, it's important in the thumbnailing stage to just kind of explore different ideas like this, just to confirm that the direction that you are headed in is the right direction. In this third thumbnail drawing, I decided to center the character, whereas in the first two thumbnails, I have the character slightly to the side. And I have heard that it's not good to center things in the composition, but I honestly really like compositions where the character or like the focal point is kind of dead center. I find myself being drawn to compositions like that, so I figured let's just push aside those kinds of rules and just go with what I feel like doing. And I drew these kind of concentric circles underneath the character, and that is based off of this photo of this area on the Palatine Hill that kind of inspired this piece in the first place. Again, I don't remember exactly what it was. In the photo, it's definitely not circles. It's like more of a, I don't know. I don't know my geometry. It's more of like a pentagon or a hexagonal shape. Something about that I really liked, and I wanted to incorporate that kind of element into the piece. So that's what the circles are for. I prefer drawing circles as opposed to hexagons. So yeah, I'm just gonna change it to circles. And then I got an idea to throw in a crown on the character, maybe as a bit of a nod to the fallen empire, maybe a little bit cringy. I'm not sure if I'm gonna go ahead with that, but yeah, I felt compelled to give the character another little accessory. And I felt like I was closer to what I wanted with the third thumbnails. So for the fourth one, I actually changed it to a vertical composition just to test out if I liked that better. Even though the whole time I was kind of envisioning this piece, I was envisioning a horizontal composition, but it doesn't hurt to try out different orientation just to make sure. And yeah, what I liked about this vertical version of this kind of same arrangement from the third thumbnail, I like that it had more kind of air space like above the character's head, and it just feels a little bit less crammed. And I think I am personally more comfortable with vertical compositions, but it does kind of change the vibe I feel from the horizontal version. So the fifth one, I do another vertical composition, but this time I try putting in the pose where the character is on her back. And I actually end up really liking this one as well. I really like the drama of this pose. Something about it feels kind of like editorial, like the character is on a shoot. Like, can't you just picture something like this for a perfume ad? Yeah, I felt like this was another direction I could potentially go in. And just for good measure, even though I already liked this third thumbnail with the character in the center of the composition, I tried it out again with the character off to the side just to see if I would like it better. But yeah, I think I still prefer having the character in the center. It just looks more intentional that way. By the end of the thumbnailing session, I felt genuinely torn between these two comps, the horizontal comp with the character sitting upright, or the vertical comp with the character lying on her back. Now, being an independent artist and this being a personal illustration project, I am my own art director and client. But if I did want some feedback from other artist friends, or if I worked on a team with an art director and I wanted to get their input, Milanote makes it easy to share your boards with collaborators where they can view and add notes or redline directly on the boards. I won't be doing that because I am prepared to live with the consequences of my own actions in the direction that I choose with this piece, but I can genuinely see how this sharing feature could be super useful when working on a group project. Instead of sending over a bunch of files around through email, you can simply share a link to your project where they can see everything, how you laid out, and how you want to present it. So now that I have the general composition of the piece figured out, I take the poses I liked in the initial brainstorming stage and I refine the drawing to nail down the pose, the expression, and the overall design. So I concentrate on fleshing out the pose, figuring out exactly how the arm and hand is placed, how the legs and feet are drawn, nailing down the design of everything like the hair, the dress, the shoes, and especially the design of the face. And this is all easier to do once I have the general idea of the pose and the composition from the earlier stages. I did really struggle with this first one here, and I don't like how this turned out. I like parts about it, but it's not a home run. I do like how the pose looks a little bit haphazard, like she's just been kind of dropped like a doll, a little rag doll like. So I will take what I like from this pose into the next drawing. Because I was a bit frustrated with my first drawing, I tried out a completely different pose here just to confirm that I want to even go in that direction. And I do like this kind of new pose. I like the look of the character's face being kind of like propped up from the volume of the skirt. And I like how the legs are kind of pointing out. Again, a little bit ragdoll-like. And I actually end up trying out a horizontal and vertical comp with this pose. And even though I liked this pose, it just didn't feel quite right in the composition in the thumbnail drawings for the feel I was going for, so I ended up scrapping it. Then I tried to do a more refined version of this pose of her lying on her back, except this time I drew the arms out, open wide and just like laying to the side, because again, I just love the drama of this kind of pose. But I don't know, I think I was going a slightly different direction with this pose, so I think this was actually confirmation for me that I need to go the other direction instead of this one. So as you can see throughout this process, I end up drawing poses that I do really like, but don't necessarily feel like is the right direction for this illustration. And it might seem like a waste, but it is totally not. I love having a backlog of these poses in my sketchbook, and I actually think taking these poses and making a board out of them is actually a really great idea. So when inspiration strikes, I'll go through this visual archive of these poses that I've drawn and possibly make a new painting out of them. So at this point, I kind of go back to the drawing board. I go back to this pose with the character sitting upright, but this time I draw the head resting on her skirt, the poofiness of the skirt, and I really like that. And just to test out this pose, I ended up drawing a like frame around it and basically drawing the full composition around it, and I decided that I like it. I just didn't love how that drawing came out. I felt like I could improve upon the drawing, so I ended up drawing it again underneath, and for some reason drawing the pose again, it brings out something new each time. And the way I drew this one, for some reason, I just felt like it flowed better. It had a more pleasing gesture, more pleasing shapes in my eyes. And I liked how I drew the face more in this one. So felt like I finally landed on the drawing that I was going to take into the final stage of the illustration. This is the drawing of the illustration. And yeah, it took a little while, but I feel like going through this process helps me feel more confident in my decision going forward with a certain direction. So studies. I don't always do studies in preparation for an illustration. It really depends on the kind of illustration. Like I've said earlier, this is probably a bad thing, but a lot of the times I like to just kind of wing it and pull from my already established visual vocabulary, and I make things up as I go along. But because this illustration is based on a very specific location with a very specific visual cues that I will need to incorporate in order to make the environment recognizable as the Roman Forum and Palatine Hill area, I felt that I was missing those gaps in my visual vocabulary. So this is where I felt I actually need to go do some studies and fill those gaps so that when I went to go draw those elements, draw the ruin pieces that I wanted to scatter throughout the composition, I would know how to draw those shapes in order to make them look convincing enough. So I just went back to that reference board full of pictures that I took while I was in Rome, and I just started copying some of the trees and the ruins, the rocks. I don't really know what to call it, but the ruin bits that I could see that looked kind of unique enough or identifiable enough, I would just copy them with a ballpoint pen. The reason why I use ballpoint pen is that I can't erase it, so I just wanted to be a little bit more mindful. And while I was doing these studies, I was trying to again pay attention to the shape language of these rocks, making note of some of the markings or engravings on the rocks that I could potentially include in my illustration to mimic the look of these column remnants. I keep calling them different things because I don't know what to call them. But yeah, hopefully you know what I mean. But with these studies, honestly, like I try not to go overboard because it's really easy to fall into the trap of always studying and not actually moving forward with the illustration. I recognize that there are so many gaps in my visual like vocab library. I don't know how to draw everything, but I can't really let that stop me. I think I just recognize there are some things I'm better at drawing and some things that I'm not, and I have to just be okay with that. And I think it's okay to let go of some things and just kind of wing it. I don't think we need to micromanage every little detail out in an illustration. But the funny thing is, some of you might be watching this and might be thinking like she is doing way too much. So yeah, it's all about perspective and just like knowing what kind of artist you are, knowing where you're willing to go hard and where you're willing to let go a little bit. After this page of studies, I'm certainly not an expert yet on ancient Roman architecture, but as long as I design it in an appealing way and it serves the compositional purpose in the piece, I think that is all that needs to be done. Now that I have the composition figured out with the thumbnails and the pose pretty much nailed down, I need to figure out the colors and styling of the piece by doing a color comp, which is basically like the thumbnail but now done in color. It helps me to 1, figure out the colors of the piece, and 2, it's a great practice run for the real painting, which will give me some helpful insight as to what to do and what not to do when the time comes to actually paint, because I'll be painting the color comp with the same media that I will use to paint the final illustration, because I really envisioned a very sunny, very airy kind of piece. That means that I will use a lot of the white of the paper to my advantage, because the white of the paper is as bright as you're going to get. No white paint is as light in value as the value of the white of the paper. So that was my reasoning for choosing watercolor. And as you guys know, I just like painting in watercolor, even though I struggle with it most of the time. I still do really like using watercolors. And before going in to paint the color comp, I made a little kind of brief in my style guide board where I have all the like art inspiration from other artists, just kind of laying out what kind of style I'm after for the piece. So I wrote out all the things that I kind of already had in mind, just to help keep me on track. And this is what I wrote down. I wrote down overexposed, sunny, high key. And that's because I envisioned a very sunny, bright piece. And I would achieve that by keeping the colors and the values very high key, so it feels very bright and very like overexposed, as things would be like in bright daylight out in the sun. And I wrote down butter yellow because I kind of envisioned the character wearing a butter yellow dress. And this might be partially influenced by a dress that I wore on a picnic recently, and it is a butter yellow dress, and I just thought it was really cute and I think it suits the picture. So let's go with that. And I wrote down create a warm glow around the character, and I wrote pastel color accents. So what I mean by that, overall, I want the colors to feel very natural, you know, just like your typical sky blue color for the sky and like a warm yellow green for the grass and the sun. Just very typical organic colors you would see out in nature, but I want to make sure in my piece, in my illustration, I find ways to throw in accents of slightly unnatural colors, like very bright pastels that you would not really see in a photo reference, colors that are placed by the artist in a very intentional way, because that is me throwing my personal touch into the illustration. So yeah, that's why I wrote down pastel color accents. I'm always looking for ways to add more color variety into my pieces because that is, I guess, my personal style. So yeah, I started out the color comp by using watercolors, and I started painting the background first because I wasn't sure how dark I could go in the character, because again, I wanted it to look very sunny and very like overexposed, which means I have to keep the colors very light. So I painted the background first to gauge how dark I could go inside the character. But basically, I was using fairly standard, very just like natural colors you would expect on a bright sunny day, because I think the kind of twist that I will bring is through the color accents that I will apply afterwards. But yeah, this color comp came together pretty easily, I would say. I think the only thing that I kind of took away from it, some like lesson I learned to not do in the final piece, is to paint the background too dark right around the character. I ended up doing that in the color comp, and then I backtracked by lifting it as much as possible because I didn't like how that looked. So I just made a note to not do that in the final painting. So hopefully I learned my lesson there. That is what the color comp is for. Usually I will try to do at least 2 color comps so I have something to compare to, but admittedly by this point in the planning process, I am feeling a little bit burnt out. And when it comes to colors, I do like to improvise on the spot more than I do with the drawing. So because I feel pretty happy with this first color comp, I feel fairly confident moving forward with the final painting with some notes. Once I have the design of the character and the pose nailed down and the composition figured out and the color direction in mind, it's finally time to prepare the painting surface with the final drawing. Lately for me these days, instead of doing the final drawing somewhere else, then transferring that onto the painting surface, I've been drawing it directly onto the painting surface, which is going to be my Arches hot press watercolor block. There are pros and cons to this. Pro is that I eliminate the step of transferring, which I find really tedious, and eliminating a boring task in the painting process helps me enjoy the process more. But the con is that sometimes the drawing doesn't go over very easily, which was the case here. I did struggle a lot getting the pose right, even though I thought I had it largely figured out in the refinement stage. I also failed to remember that the Arches block that I'm working on has a slightly different proportion than the ratio that I use for my thumbnails. So I kind of had to adjust the composition a little bit on the fly and extend the composition a little bit on the sides because the Arches block is a little bit longer than I remembered. But overall, I think I do prefer to try and draw directly onto the painting surface since I like how more tactile it is, and it kind of makes me skip ahead of that dreaded white paper stage. Since I'm already getting in there, I'm making a mess, so how much worse could I make this? But yeah, this is how the drawing turned out, and now it's ready to be painted. I'm going to add this final drawing to the main board, my Italy illustration project board, and see how the overall project board looks. If I feel I don't want to work on the painting right away, which I won't be doing because that will be a separate video, then I can come back to this project board and have everything I need in order to just pick it back up again when I feel ready. And I think for me, that is kind of the biggest draw when it comes to Milanote, in how it keeps a visual archive of all of your project ideas that you can easily store for a rainy day and come back to when you are ready. So I hope you enjoyed me going through my illustration process in full with the help of Milanote. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so sign up using the link below in the description box whenever you feel that creative spark and if you want a little help to bring your project to life. And if you do end up checking out Milanote, definitely let me know down below in the comments whether you liked it, whether you found it helpful for your process, because everyone's process is different. Alright, that is it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!